It was only when I met Emma Turner that I realized I was merely a stand-in for Alexander Blake. That day, Alexander's cousin, Sarah Turner, was hosting a small gathering.
You look beautiful today, Lily.
Thank you, Sarah.
Sarah's gaze briefly flickered to Alexander's face. I didn't understand the meaning behind that glance until later.
Alexander, do you like my dress? I wore it just for you.
HM? Oh yes, it's nice.
His mind was elsewhere, his eyes fixed on his beloved. I don't remember who it was that called out Emma Turner in an exaggerated tone. Only then did I notice a stunning beauty sitting in a corner of the yard.
Who is she?
That's Emma Turner.
Following her gaze, I saw Alexander and Emma locking eyes. I couldn't describe my feelings at that moment. The phrase "a poor imitation" was all that came to mind.
Hello, I'm Emma Turner.
Instinctively, I looked at Alexander. He seemed to smile, a smile reminiscent of Sarah's earlier glance. I felt a slight tug at my heart. From the moment she appeared, Alexander's gaze never once fell on me. That night, emboldened by alcohol, I asked Alexander.
You knew Emma Turner before, didn't you?
Emma Turner? Who doesn't know her?
Indeed, who didn't know the once wildly popular Emma Turner? But that wasn't what I meant. I knew he understood, but he refused to answer.
Lily Harris isn't a title enough for you?
The pain was indescribable. It wasn't just the insulting words, it was the complete absence of any affection in his tone. I smiled, pretending not to care.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked.
Lily Harris, is it wrong for someone to like you?
I knew such words would reassure him, even though I spoke the truest words in the most insincere tone.
After all these years, your acting skills haven't improved at all.
I remained silent. I knew my acting wasn't good. This wasn't the first time he had said so. When the media captured our relationship, I was terrified and ran to him to explain.
I really didn't know there were reporters there.
Lily Harris, you're not cut out for acting.
He saw right through me. Although I wasn't involved, I knew the company wanted to use our relationship for publicity. I knew but didn't stop it, perhaps secretly hoping to make our relationship public.
Don't do this again.
His words were gentle, but I felt a chill. I knew I had crossed a line. I thought he would clarify our relationship, but he didn't. He said nothing and even announced our engagement 6 months later. Naturally, I was overjoyed. Later, I heard from Sarah that he had a falling out with his family because of this. His mood was terrible, and I felt very guilty. Once, I saw him smoking on the terrace. I walked over and squatted in front of him.
I'm sorry. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have had a falling out with your family.
Because of you?
He scrutinized me, then nodded slightly and smiled.
Yes, partly because of you.
When the ambiguous photos of Alexander Blake and Emma Turner were sent to me by Emily Johnson, I was on set filming. Emily was even angrier than I was.
Emma Turner is quite a celebrity. How could she be so shameless?
I remained silent, thinking about my past.
How was I any different from her? Didn't I also use a photo to indirectly force Alexander Blake to acknowledge our relationship?
How can you compare? Back then, both of you were single. Now, everyone knows you are Alexander Blake's fiancée.
But maybe Alexander Blake would prefer Emma Turner as his girlfriend. Because of that photo, I became a joke in the entertainment industry. People dug up the history between Emma Turner and Alexander Blake, painting them as star-crossed lovers. After they fell in love, Emma Turner left in a fit of anger due to the Blake family's opposition, thus separating from Alexander Blake. Some people felt sorry for Emma Turner, believing the two would have ended up together if it weren't for me.
If it weren't for me.
I became a supporting character in their story. Some even fabricated stories online, claiming I had come between them, causing their breakup. Unfortunately, some people believed these lies, including many in the crew. One afternoon, I fainted on set due to exhaustion. The staff helped me to a chair, thinking I was asleep because my eyes were closed. I overheard a conversation between a small actress and her assistant. The actress whispered, but I clearly heard 2 sentences.
Did she really steal Emma's boyfriend?
It seems so. I heard Mr. Blake had a falling out with his family because of Miss Turner, and Lily feared they would reconcile. So she exposed her photos with Mr. Blake, forcing him to acknowledge their relationship.
I never would have guessed. It seems she's only standing in the entertainment industry because of Alexander Blake.
I suddenly felt pathetic. Maybe most of what they said was inaccurate, and they even got the sequence of events wrong. But one thing I did hear and believe, Alexander Blake's falling out with his family wasn't because of me. Thinking back to when I apologized to Alexander Blake on the terrace, I couldn't help but feel sorry for myself. At that time, did Alexander Blake laugh at my self-deception in his heart? Because of filming, I hadn't been back for a long time. Alexander Blake rarely called me, but one late afternoon, he called me as I was sitting on the hotel balcony watching the sunset.
Is there something you need?
He was silent for a moment.
Can't I call you without a reason?
I remained silent, and he suddenly laughed lazily.
I miss you.
For both of us, sweet words were just an act. But today, I particularly hoped he meant it.
Do you really miss me?
He probably didn't expect me to respond like that and didn't answer. Instead, he asked,
What's wrong? Are you in a bad mood?
Not knowing how to respond, I reverted to our usual way of interacting.
See, my acting is pretty good, right? Did I scare you?
He didn't laugh.
Lily Harris, don't act in front of me anymore.
I said softly.
I understand.
His voice softened.
When will you finish filming?
I didn't respond, so he teased.
Are you crying?
Alexander Blake, I miss you.
To my great surprise, Alexander Blake appeared before me the next day after I finished filming a scene where I fell off a horse. I was stunned seeing him standing outside the set.
So happy you're dumbfounded?
I was really dumbfounded with happiness. I ran to him, hugging him tightly.
Lily Harris, you're getting mud all over me.
I didn't even notice what he said, rubbing my cheek against his chest. He surrendered and hugged me.
Why did you come to see me?
Passing by on a business trip.
On the way to the hotel, he was on the phone the whole time. I was bored, looking out the window and sighing. He pinched my fingers.
What do you want to eat?
Anything.
However, we didn't even get to eat. As soon as we entered the room, he kissed me passionately. At the crucial moment, I said,
We haven't eaten yet.
Didn't you say you missed me?
Blushing, I buried my head in the pillow. Afterwards, Alexander Blake suddenly said,
Don't act anymore.
I was very surprised.
Covered in mud, looking like a little rascal.
I realized he must have seen me filming that afternoon. My heart warmed, and I lost my composure.
But what would I do if I don't act? Will you marry me and make me a full-time housewife?
As soon as I said it, I regretted it, feeling like I was pushing for marriage. Afraid he would refuse, I quickly added,
I was joking.
He smiled and touched my hair.
Is that your wish?
I remained silent, not daring to admit it. He didn't say anything more, gently removing my hand from his neck and getting out of bed to take a shower. My mood suddenly turned very bad. He didn't want to marry me. He didn't want to marry me at all. He came here not because he missed me, but because he needed someone to keep him company. That night, I had a dream where Alexander Blake and I parted ways. I woke up in tears. Alexander Blake had his back to me. I moved closer, hugging him from behind, my cheek pressed against his back, and whispered,
Alexander Blake, if possible, I want to go somewhere with you where no one else is. Would you be willing?
The only response was the sound of his steady breathing. Alexander Blake left the next afternoon, and I was very reluctant to see him go. As he was leaving, I asked,
When can you come again?
He smiled.
Already thinking about it before I'm even gone?
I giggled foolishly, and he pinched my cheek.
Next month will be very busy.
Meaning he wouldn't have time to come again. I nodded, feeling a bit disappointed because his birthday was in 2 weeks. I had told him before that I didn't want to miss any of his birthdays, but he might have already forgotten my words. But it didn't matter. As long as I remembered, it was fine. I had already prepared his birthday gift long ago. He usually wore a watch, so I had someone abroad buy a limited edition one. Though the design was conservative, it suited him well. The day I took leave, the director asked me why.
Why are you taking leave?
I'm going on a date with a handsome guy.
The director laughed, and the surrounding staff laughed along. I didn't tell Alexander Blake, I wanted to surprise him. However, when I finally found out the location of his evening gathering and dressed up beautifully to push open the private room door, I realized my arrival was not a surprise but a shock. The room fell silent, as if someone had pressed the pause button. At first, I didn't understand.
Sister-in-law, why are you here?
From his eyes, I knew things were not simple. There was a balcony at the back of the room, separated by a glass door. I saw Emma Turner standing there, and beside her was my fiancé, Alexander Blake. I suddenly understood that my fiancé didn't need me to accompany him for his birthday, he needed Emma Turner. And everyone in the room knew about their past, except me. Emma Turner had her head down as if she were crying, and Alexander Blake gently wiped the tears from her face. I never remembered him treating me like that. I stood at the door. They were so focused that they didn't notice my arrival. Emma Turner pushed Alexander Blake's hand away petulantly and said softly,
I returned your things. How you handle them is none of my business.
Alexander Blake said nothing, looking down at her with such tenderness that I didn't know what he was thinking at that moment. He suddenly smiled and said,
Do you know what I used to like most about you? It was.
What was it? I really wanted to hear. But someone suddenly shouted.
Sister-in-law!
The shout disturbed the two on the balcony. Alexander Blake turned his head to look, and at that moment, the tenderness in his eyes disappeared, replaced by surprise. I suddenly felt ashamed, as if I were the extra one among the three of us. I wanted to leave, but my feet seemed not to belong to me. I couldn't move. Alexander Blake opened the glass door and said,
"Why are you here?"
"Naturally, I came to celebrate your birthday." I looked up at him, grateful that I still had some professional acting skills to smile at this moment.
Alexander Blake, happy birthday.
For some reason, I didn't want to take out the watch I had prepared for him long ago.
I came back in a hurry and didn't prepare a gift for you. I'm sorry.
He frowned at me. I smiled, trying to appear relaxed, but I found I couldn't, not at all.
I'm sorry, I have something to do. I have to go.
I turned around, and Alexander Blake grabbed my wrist. I don't know where I got the strength, but I shook his hand off. He was stunned, and so was I. We stared at each other. It might have been just a second or two, but it felt like a very long time to me. It was as if I had entered a closed space, and I couldn't breathe. I had to leave.
I'm sorry, I have to go.
I didn't know why I kept wanting to say those 3 words, as if at that moment, I couldn't say anything else. That day, Alexander Blake still drove me home. Even though it was the height of summer, I felt cold in the car, and my body was trembling. Alexander Blake reached out to touch my forehead. I instinctively dodged, but he was determined and turned my face towards him.
"Lily Harris, I didn't know you were coming back."
I was silent. He ordered,
"Speak."
Alexander Blake, do you want to break up with me?
He was very surprised, and his face turned cold, as if he were angry.
"Do you want to break up?"
I looked at him, tears streaming down my face. He said,
"Could you bear it?"
He asked the question so confidently. He saw through me, he knew I couldn't bear it. He pulled me into his arms and said,
"Lily Harris, stop making trouble."
I knew I was foolish. I couldn't refuse him. That night, I saw a ring in Alexander Blake's clothes, in a brocade box, like an engagement ring. When Alexander Blake came out of the shower, I was sitting on the floor examining the ring. I glanced at him, and he seemed a bit distracted. Maybe I was too fascinated by the ring and hadn't put it down.
"Do you like it?"
I looked up, against the light. I couldn't see his face clearly. He was so tall, standing there, that I had to look up hard to see him. He squatted down, and I finally saw his face with a faint smile.
"Lily Harris, let's get married."
At that moment, my feelings were very complicated. I didn't know whether to be happy or sad. When I didn't know how to answer him, he had already lowered his head and kissed me. I think I should have been excited. The person I liked proposed to me. Why wouldn't I be happy? But I felt a stone pressing on my heart. I couldn't move it, nor could I digest it. Once, I saw him smoking on the terrace. I walked over and squatted in front of him.
I'm sorry. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have had a falling out with your family.
He lifted his long lashes, took a drag of his cigarette.
"Because of you?"
He scrutinized me, then nodded slightly and smiled.
"Yes, partly because of you."
The night was heavy with tension. Sarah had told Lily about the fallout.
Lily, You know, he had a falling out with his family because of this.
Lily's heart sank with guilt as she spotted him on the terrace, smoking.
I'm sorry. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have had a falling out with your family.
He lifted his long lashes, took a drag of his cigarette, and looked at her.
Because of you?
He scrutinized her, then nodded slightly and smiled.
Yes, partly because of you.
Narrator, tone, sad once, I saw him smoking on the terrace. I walked over and squatted in front of him.
I'm sorry. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have had a falling out with your family.
He lifted his long lashes, took a drag of his cigarette, and looked at me.
Alexander, tone, serious because of you?
He scrutinized me, then nodded slightly and smiled.
Alexander, tone, serious yes, partly because of you.
They finally walked towards me from the crowd. I touched my chest and realized that as time passed, I no longer felt much about the situation in front of me. I could even smile and greet them.
Mr. Blake, Miss Turner. Long time no see.
Without the emotional entanglement of Alexander Blake, I found that I could act in front of people just like Emma Turner. My hair was no longer as messy as the last time he saw me. My ear-length hair was now curled playfully. My dress was no longer a long one, and fans discovered I had a pair of straight, slender legs. He seemed a bit lost.
Alex, Miss Harris is greeting you.
Alexander Blake looked at me and asked.
How have you been?
Very well.
In our conversation, we ignored Emma Turner. She suddenly spoke up.
I heard your recent opportunities haven't been great. I just took on a new role. How about I speak to the director and have you play the second female lead?
I smiled without responding, but Alexander Blake raised an eyebrow at her words. Emma Turner's smile stiffened.
At least the second female lead in my show isn't a malicious, annoying character.
I wouldn't let her bully me again. I shook my head and said.
No need, I'm afraid of being set up again.
Emma Turner probably didn't expect me to lash out. My pointed words finally made her face change color. She instinctively glanced at Alexander Blake, then tried to maintain her smile.
What are you talking about?
At that moment, I saw a bit of her true nature.
Miss Turner, don't you understand what I mean?
Seeing Emma Turner's face turn pale, I felt extremely satisfied.
It's not worth using such a self-sacrificial tactic for a man.
Emma could cry and deny it, but Alexander Blake's suspicious eyes made her slow, causing her to miss the best opportunity. Her silence was undoubtedly an admission. There were already quite a few people around, and I didn't lower my voice on purpose. At this point, people were looking our way. Emma Turner's face was very unpleasant. Alexander Blake probably understood the meaning behind my words. He suddenly looked at Emma Turner, his gaze extremely cold. People around were whispering, most of them knew about the grudge between Emma Turner and me. I heard someone incredulously say,
What does she mean? Did Emma Turner fall on purpose that time? If so, she's really manipulative. Just for a man, she almost ruined her face. She's ruthless.
I no longer needed to stay here. I believed that in less than 10 minutes, the matter between Emma Turner and me would be spread online. Her victim persona would soon be overturned by netizens, but that had nothing to do with me. Just as I was leaving, Alexander Blake stopped me. My emotions erupted at that moment, and I pushed him away forcefully.
Alexander Blake, you always thought I was the one who hurt her, didn't you?
He didn't respond, his face like a layer of frost. I suddenly felt it was meaningless and smiled, saying,
"Forget it."
Later, Alexander Blake contacted me once. I hung up as soon as I saw the number. Someone as proud as him wouldn't contact me again. I remained busy, and my fulfilling days left me no time to think about past people and events. Until one night, when I was driving home, I noticed a car following mine. My agent, Jessica Adams, was frightened and wanted to call the police, but I stopped her because it was Alexander Blake's car. I sighed and asked the driver to pull over. Alexander followed suit. I knocked on his window. He was sitting in the back seat.
Get in the car.
I didn't want to, so I stood by the door, hesitating.
Lily Harris, you used to listen to me.
He had been drinking and was leaning back in his seat, looking at me. I felt a pang in my heart.
Please, get in the car.
I still didn't move. He sighed and pushed open the car door. The smell of alcohol was strong as soon as the door opened. I regretted letting him get out, fearing he might need my support to stand, but he seemed steady enough.
I'm sorry.
I remained silent. I knew why he was apologizing, but I no longer needed it.
You've changed.
I looked at the streetlight without speaking.
You used to have a sparkle in your eyes when you saw me. Your smile was genuine back then. Now, even though you smile, it's so fake, just like those strangers on the street.
He had changed too. He used to be a man of few words around me, and this sudden verbosity was likely due to the alcohol.
You're drunk. Get back in the car.
He didn't speak, his brow furrowed with a hint of sadness.
Lily Harris, do you not love me anymore?
I was shocked and looked at him blankly. I used to love him so much that I would have done anything for him. But he didn't love me back then, and all I could do was humbly try to win his attention. Now he was asking if I didn't love him anymore, and I found it laughable. He suddenly laughed, holding his forehead.
I'm sorry. I must really be drunk.
I said.
I'll have the driver help you.
I was about to call the driver when he grabbed my arm. In that moment, I noticed the watch on his wrist, the one I had planned to give him for his birthday but never did. I distinctly remembered throwing it in the trash. I looked up in confusion. He didn't notice my gaze, his smile fading. Staring into my eyes, he said.
Lily Harris, don't be so cold to me, please.
At this point, revenge no longer held much meaning. When we parted, I had imagined countless scenarios of our reunion, where I would tell him I had forgotten him. But now that the moment had come, I found I had no desire to say those words. Rehashing the past over and over only proved I hadn't moved on. My prolonged silence disappointed him. He let go of me, opened the car door, but then paused.
Lily Harris, if you need help, let me know.
I knew he thought I was struggling in the entertainment industry because I had played so many unlikable supporting roles, but I didn't need his help. I had developed my unique acting style, and after years of hard work, I finally landed a major role in a big production with a cast full of talented actors. I finally got to play the lead role, and it was based on my own merit. The role was substantial, and the script was incredibly engaging. Daniel Johnson was the male lead in this production. He was silent and stubborn. Initially, I didn't like him much, and I thought he didn't like me either. But later, I realized my intuition was wrong. During a wire stunt scene, due to a mechanical failure, we fell from over 2 meters high. He disregarded his own safety and chose to hold me, cushioning my fall. I wasn't hurt at all, but he ended up with a fracture. In the hospital, I asked him why he did that.
Why did you do that?
He looked at me and smiled.
I was afraid you'd get seriously hurt.
I felt bad initially, but his words made me laugh through my tears.
But you should take care of yourself first.
You're more important.
Later, when I got together with Daniel Johnson, I often thought of that sentence. It was probably because of those words that I decided to be with him. In my life, no one had ever valued my life more than their own. As I expected, I became very popular because of this drama, receiving widespread acclaim online. Some people compared me to Emma Turner, but she was heavily criticized, with people saying someone as manipulative as her didn't deserve to be compared to me. Even Alexander Blake was criticized, with people saying he was blind. Because of this drama, I won many domestic awards and also found love. At an awards ceremony, Daniel Johnson and I publicly announced our relationship. The host used our story to liven up the event. I was very shy, and Daniel held my hand tightly.
Our Lily is very shy, don't tease her.
Everyone laughed, and I buried my face in his shoulder, too embarrassed to face the cameras. At that moment, I suddenly noticed Alexander Blake in the second-floor audience. He was watching us with a cold gaze, specifically looking at Daniel Johnson. Instinctively, I used my body to shield him. I had been with Alexander long enough to understand his every look. I knew what that gaze meant. He wanted to hurt Daniel, but I didn't understand why. During my time of both career and romantic success, I didn't have much time to ponder these things. Even the news of Alexander Blake and Emma Turner's engagement came from my agent. She expressed her surprise.
I didn't expect them to end up together.
I didn't care much about it. Hearing the news, I felt relieved, realizing my previous speculations were just my own wishful thinking. Later, at a dinner party, I met Emma Turner. Because of the previous incident, her public image had collapsed. The internet was full of criticism about her. Although her career wasn't completely ruined, she couldn't get any good roles anymore. However, there were still people clinging to her, whispering to her.
Emma, isn't this the person who slandered you last time? Fortunately, Mr. Blake saw through it.
I heard it clearly but didn't care. Emma glanced at that person and then walked towards me.
Do you have time? Let's talk.
I don't mind.
We went to the balcony on the side of the banquet hall. Emma had already closed the door, shutting out the noise from the hall. She took a cigarette from her handbag and offered it to me. I shook my head.
Of course, a good girl like you wouldn't smoke.
I had thought she was the same type as me, but now it seemed we were worlds apart.
What do you want?
When Alexander and I get engaged, you must come.
Of course.
She was silent for a while, no longer as magnanimous as before. She looked at me and said in a low voice.
Lily Harris, I won.
I smiled, suddenly finding her a bit childish.
Send an invitation to Daniel Johnson for the engagement. I'll come with him.
She finally couldn't keep up the pretense, her face turning dark. Just as I was about to shake her off, I heard someone calling my name. I looked in the direction of the voice and saw Alexander Blake pounding on the glass door of the balcony. Emma had locked the door.
Lily!
Alexander kicked the glass door, shattering it. He rushed through the broken glass and pulled me away from Emma.
Emma, what are you trying to do?
Emma remained calm, took a drag of her cigarette, and smiled.
Why are you so nervous? Afraid I'll hurt her?
Alexander firmly grasped my wrist and shielded me behind him.
Alexander, don't you find it ridiculous? Clearly, you want to hurt her.
Emma!
Emma suddenly exploded.
Don't think I don't know what you're doing. You've been searching like crazy for her these past 2 days.
Enough! Let's part ways peacefully.
Emma suddenly choked up, full of grievances.
I am your fiancé.
We broke up a long time ago. I never said I would marry you. The ring wasn't put on your finger by me.
A crowd had gathered outside, watching the commotion. Those who had been clinging to Emma had already turned against her.
Oh my God, it was all made up by her. I knew she wasn't a good person.
Alexander, you fell in love with her. You actually fell in love with her.
I seemed not to understand and looked at Alexander.
Yes, I fell in love with her. Maybe I loved her a long time ago.
Emma was nearly collapsing.
But you shouldn't have proposed to her with the ring meant for me.
Sorry, you returned the ring to me that day, and I hadn't had a chance to get rid of it.
Alexander tightly held my hand and turned to leave. He held my hand and led me downstairs. Only then did I have a chance to shake him off.
Alexander, what are you doing?
His eyes never left me.
Lily Harris, let's start over.
I turned around abruptly, surprised at his words.
Alexander, I already have a boyfriend.
He suddenly became agitated and took out a cigarette.
Break up with him.
I was furious and raised my hand to slap him. He grabbed my wrist and threatened.
You know I have ways to separate you too.
Alexander, if you dare to hurt him.
Alexander suddenly let go of me.
Lily Harris, don't mention him in front of me.
I closed my mouth, staring at him.
Lily Harris, don't look at me like that. It makes me want to hurt him.
We are getting married.
The incident made the news, and Emma Turner had no choice but to voluntarily leave the entertainment industry. I was afraid Daniel Johnson would misunderstand, but he trusted me and didn't ask anything. I was very grateful to him. However, ever since I heard Alexander Blake's words, I had been uneasy, knowing he wouldn't let it go easily. A month later, I received an unsigned express letter. When I opened the envelope and saw the contents of the photos, I was so frightened that I dropped them on the ground. At that moment, I received a call from Alexander Blake.
Did you see the letter?
I was a bit slow to react and didn't speak for a long time.
Scared?
Alexander Blake, what do you mean?
My attitude made him suddenly cold.
Lily Harris, you fell in love with him.
Yes, I love Daniel Johnson. I love.
No!
I heard his heavy breathing. He said,
No one but me can have you.
I was thinking of what to say to placate him, but he had already calmed down.
8 p.m. tonight, I'll be waiting for you at the hotel. I'll wait for 1 hour. If you don't come, I'll expose these photos.
I didn't know what to do. I didn't dare tell Daniel Johnson, fearing he would recklessly call the police. That would ruin his future, and I didn't want him to lose his career because of me. At 8 p.m., I arrived at the agreed location on time. When I pushed open the door and saw Alexander Blake sitting on the sofa drinking, it felt like the first time I met him. Time seemed to rewind, but our hearts were completely different.
Alexander Blake, what do you want?
He looked at me with some sadness.
You really came for him.
He stood up and walked towards me.
Do you know what coming here means?
I didn't respond. Of course, I knew. A man inviting a woman to a hotel had obvious intentions, even a fool would know. He touched my cheek, stroked my short hair.
I used to love your long hair, but you cut it.
His fingers slid from my face to my chest, and he lowered his eyelids.
Even your most precious heart, you gave it to someone else.
I didn't expect him to say that. If I still loved him, I would have felt wronged, but now I just found it laughable.
You didn't want it.
He lifted his eyes and suddenly smiled.
Did you ask me? How do you know I didn't want it?
But did I need to ask? I had eyes, I could see. My heart leapt because it couldn't feel his love, but now, hearing him say this, I felt powerless. I didn't want to bring up the past.
Alexander Blake, we ended a long time ago.
He shook his head, disagreeing.
I don't agree. As long as I don't agree, we can never end.
I closed my eyes. He cupped my face.
Lily Harris, let's reconcile.
It was laughable, utterly laughable.
I have already fallen in love with someone else.
I opened my eyes and saw the fleeting light in his eyes. My heart pounded. I didn't know what he thought at that moment, but it wasn't good. I didn't dare confront him head-on. I knew how cold and powerful he was. I softened my tone.
Alexander Blake, let it go, okay? I believe you'll find someone better.
He shook his head, then shook it again, looking a bit lost.
None of them are you.
The conversation hit a dead end. I didn't know how to persuade him, so I closed my eyes. He lowered his head to kiss me. I turned away to avoid him, but my action made him sad.
Lily Harris, that person was once kept by someone.
I remained silent. Daniel Johnson had told me about his past when he confessed to me. He was very poor back then, extremely poor. He had to do those things for his siblings. I didn't blame him, everyone has their hardships. Alexander Blake's face twisted suddenly.
You know? You'd rather choose someone like that?
I got anxious, hating the disdain in his tone. I pushed him away, distancing myself from him.
Alexander Blake, what's the difference between me and him? When I was with you, without public exposure, wasn't that the same as being kept by you?
You call that being kept?
He was angry, furious, and suddenly kicked the coffee table beside him. I stood near the coffee table, and its corner scraped me, causing pain. I instinctively squatted down. He rushed over, picked me up from the ground. I struggled, but he forcefully held me in his arms.
You're doing this on purpose to anger me, aren't you?
I didn't respond, but struggled hard. Finally, I made him angry. He lowered his head to find my lips. At first, I resisted with all my strength, but later I realized I was no match for him. If he wanted to do something, I couldn't stop him. I stopped struggling, letting him hold me like waiting for the inevitable. He stopped, pressing his forehead against mine without speaking. At that moment, I felt his pain and remembered my past self. Loving someone could be so humble. I pitied him and my past self.
Alexander Blake, if being with you means you'll let him go, then I can be with you.
I unbuttoned my shirt, 1 button, 2 buttons. When I reached the 4th button, he finally stopped me. He suddenly let go of me and stood up from the sofa.
Lily Harris, you can go.
Alexander Blake didn't expose Daniel Johnson's matter. I thought our story would end there. But later, I realized that was just my wishful thinking. Alexander Blake never intended to end it. After that, Daniel Johnson and I announced our engagement and started preparing for the wedding. During that time, I was so happy and busy that I forgot about Alexander Blake's existence. On the wedding day, I received a call from Alexander Blake. It was just before dawn, the bridal party hadn't arrived yet, and I was already dressed in my wedding gown, waiting for Daniel Johnson. When Alexander Blake called, I thought it was Daniel Johnson. Without checking the number, I answered.
Daniel.
There was silence on the other end for a moment before I realized I might have mistaken the caller. I looked at the phone and saw a familiar number.
Sorry, I thought it was Daniel Johnson.
Lily Harris, does marrying him make you that happy?
I didn't dare to speak. After what happened last time, I was afraid of saying something that might offend him.
Let's meet.
I was very reluctant.
Just one last time.
I had no choice but to agree. His car was parked downstairs. I opened the back door and got in, struggling a bit with my cumbersome wedding dress. It was still dark, and the car was dimly lit. I reached up to turn on the light, but my hand was suddenly grasped. Startled, I angrily shook him off, and he turned on the light.
Alexander Blake, what do you want?
He leaned back and looked at me, at my makeup and my elaborate wedding dress. His gaze made me uncomfortable, and I lowered my head to adjust my skirt.
Can you not marry him?
We're getting married today.
The sky was gradually getting brighter, and the car light was no longer necessary. I turned it off.
I need to go.
He suddenly locked the car doors, and I looked at him in surprise.
If Daniel Johnson were gone, would you come back to me?
I was shocked and couldn't believe he would say such a thing. But I was also afraid he might actually do something. I called Daniel Johnson, but his phone was off.
What are you planning?
He grabbed my hand, nonchalantly saying,
How about we become lovers?
I looked at him as if he were crazy. He didn't care about my reaction and continued.
You marry him, and we maintain a lover's relationship.
I didn't understand why he was pushing me to this extent. I trembled uncontrollably.
You have two choices now, marry me or do as I just said.
I suddenly realized he was in a state of madness, and confronting him head-on would do me no good. But I was scared, really scared he might do something to Daniel Johnson. At this point, he was capable of anything.
You know, when I loved you, I wanted to marry you immediately. But you weren't even willing to make our relationship public. In the end, you didn't have me in your heart. You treated me as Emma Turner's shadow. When she came back, you thought I should leave. Now that I've left, why do you insist on entangling with me again?
Tears rolled down my face. I hated crying in front of him and wiped them away with my hand. Alexander Blake was finally moved. He hugged me despite my resistance.
Yes, I also thought I loved her until you left. Now heaven is using this same method to torment me.
Alexander Blake, if anything happens to Daniel Johnson, I won't live either.
He suddenly let go of me, as if he couldn't believe I would do such a thing. I looked out the window. The sky was bright, and Daniel Johnson should be arriving soon.
If you don't believe me, you can try.
In the end, Alexander Blake let me go, and I married Daniel Johnson as planned. One day after the wedding, while sorting through the gifts, I discovered a brand new set of keys. Puzzled, I checked the gift list and found out they were from Jessica Adams. I decided to call her, hoping for an explanation.
Curious, Jessica, I found a set of keys with your name on the gift list. What are they for?
She refused to say anything, leaving me with no choice but to let it go. Many years later, Jessica got drunk and finally revealed the truth.
Drunk, whispering. It was from Alexander Blake. He bought you a villa in a small town in the south. He said if you ever separated from Daniel Johnson, you should go find him there.
I was speechless. Memories of that night in the hotel with the crew flooded back. I had once asked him a question, thinking he was asleep.
Serious, I remember that night. I threw the keys into the storage room, knowing I would never use them.